Hello everyone, today we talk about some aspects of early modern military discipline, a topic that we have already started browsing and that definitely we won't stop doing for more than a while. We have appreciated especially the toughness involved in the creation of the so-called early modern armies, essentially Renaissance warfare based on more concentrated style administration of armies management, fundamentally under any point of view, how this fundamentally passed through also an alteration what had been at least the historical ratios of strength between the various estates in society. This was actually not a moment, I will also repeat it ad nauseam, of increase in individual liberty, nor socially, nor, say, of course, also from a military point of view. If anything, it was the contrary. This was the full affirmation of the ancien regime, disciplining ever larger amounts of people than before in interest of the single authority that was able to do so. So disciplining not just some soldiers, some levies that had been recruited for, say, the sake of this or that military enterprise, but first and foremost, the communities that they represented. All right, this is a dynamic that went on for throughout the entire era. It's something that also civilizationally goes always on by degree, and that entails the gradual acceptation of, say, a more, in fact, directly concentrated control of the armed forces in exchange for some greater, for example, the lack of tranquility, at least as far as, for example, the lack of billeting troops right in the local, within the very communities had been the norm up to that point, obviously giving ever more power to some specific estates, but at the same time allowing, as you know, during these centuries also a general growth that eventually the third estate especially would benefit of and bring into the revolutions of the 18th century. Today will not be specific about this century or another. Will focus mostly on the 18th century, something about the 17th, but it encompasses the entire era, also 16th or even parts of 15th century warfare. There is a literature behind the enforcement of such military discipline. There is normally a moralistic presupposition. That is to say, whichever was the cause, mostly, especially in the first part of the period, it was a confessional one. It was a project of reform or defense of Catholicism. And it was, if you want, like a propaganda, right, to, in part, also brainwash those very people who were being very often also forcibly dragged into a campaign. And that, in fact, gets equally satirized, let's say, in many, in some also the greatest artistic, say, pieces in the history of mankind. Think about Non più andrai, Mozart da Ponte, or all this, of course, criticism of the idea of glory and of this fresh, youthful warfare. It was instead sort of wretched, miserable, and we already observed, as I was saying before, especially this very aspect, right? How the dignity that had subsisted, at least among those who had borne arms during, for example, the medieval period. I have a video that is going to encounter very important in that sense regarding especially the Germanic ethos, like that was infused from the migration era, lasting throughout the Middle Ages, with this higher sense of honor and individual liberty and sort of autonomous, in fact, compliance to the loyalty towards the chiefs, etc. The modern era is as we know from Machiavelli, from many other authors, it's a sort of break with that, where at least the elites maintained that kind of aristocratic, say, awareness of the necessities of such a type of lifestyle. We're just citing Montaigne, for example, regarding the full awareness of the fact that the nobility, especially in that French context, had to maintain all their privileges, but in function of their actual of the success of their actual military performance, for example. So a world that we tended to read mostly through the Renaissance as in this progressivistic interpretation, at least of the same, and not through the continuity and the quite effortful, like almost desperate maintenance of power in a system was becoming ever more difficult to wield in some ways, because of it was actually easier when you look at the single polity and realize how power was getting concentrated, even there with enormous difficulties. As you know, there is a series on the Habsburgs that documents, especially in that case, an ever more complicated situation. But it's rather the broader picture of the world. It's faster changes. The greatest risks probably that were behind this power, say, the cause of this power concentration methods of Stylus. Greater powers that have ever greater force and that therefore can destabilize the system, that must grow, must develop further, but that also will find reasons for agitation from within as well. There are some other more sort of material, physical aspects of this broader necessity of discipline enforced among the troops. For example, an underestimated one is the hygienic side of the story, right? And there is no doubt, because these were some among the most compelling. We'll have to make more videos on logistics and especially the chemical, like proper difficulties that occur when you concentrate so many people and animals in the same place for a long time, and how this affects the same warfare to an important degree. And these hygienic worries, in many ways, even though less publicized because they were less edifying than others, were actually some of the strongest factors in the development of discipline in general throughout all history. They had actually always been there, but they were never enough, as you know, especially when armies were becoming bigger and warfare was getting also more complicated, campaigns were longer, etc. And so the sustenance of an army under many points of view was definitely ever more connected with say steady supplies, some stronger logistical systems, and also a more consistent, more present medical activity in the army. In this time, everything was still fairly primitive, right? But we cannot unsee how partly also the humanitarian aspects of discipline were often connected with hygiene. It's difficult to see how, in absolute terms, the factors intertwined. This is not necessarily just for the troops. Of course, caring for your hygiene is something that gives you motivation, gives you a routine, and in terms of immense stress can help you surpass even the boredom, like the dead moments between the horrors of war that, as we know, are actually the ones that are the toughest to bear. Right, when adrenaline kicks in, you are into the fray. You have enormous issues, but at least you work. And as we've seen, an incredibly and actually alienating military training was increasingly more effective as far as maintaining cold blood into that hellish hail of lead and bloodshed that took place all around and over you. But the humanitarian concerns, of course, were connected also with the relation between the military and the civilians. That is actually something relatively novel, right? It's conventionally considered that only in the second half of the 17th century a first sense of international conventions began to appear to spare the civilians from sort of the greatest horrors of war, so that would be largely ineffective in many circumstances. But it also made sense as it was functional sometimes to the same logistical needs. Then, of course, warfare, as we know, is a continuation of politics with other means. So if you want just to terrorize a population, to massacre civilians and whatever, that is going to happen, unfortunately. Anyway, the point though was that the world up to that point had not really seen much of a difference between the two. I mean, there was a traditional sense of the fact that those who bore arms were on average were higher people, like they had a greater power. They were blessed by God through different echelons of other actors, like within the hierarchy of this as media, but there hadn't quite been much of a great separation of the world's military war from the civilian one, nor for most people who participate into warfare, like the difference really existed. I mean, a civilian, a person living in a situation that by this point had, especially from the later Middle Ages, witnessed a gradual disarming of the population and plus an ever less frequent involvement into combat, would have naturally, in fact, seen war as something more or less habitual in the political landscape, but hopefully not coming to your doorsteps. But also, of course, the local communities were organized, militia, etc. That they had the bare minimum to cooperate in that regard. We are, especially in the first part of the modern age, really in an era of mercenarism. That's together with the nuclei of first sort of statal force that, however, is not nearly as close to be as dominant. You have to wait Louis XIV to have properly a modern national army. In that sense, had definitely increased the difference between professionals, war professionals, and the others in general, so that even the militias, as you know, were not that great thing, right? They would mostly defend their own homes. It was pretty much it. During the Middle Ages, actually, things had been different. Like, it turns out that not the majority, but definitely a higher amount of people than we consider even in, the Prussian population at the time of Frederick the Great, were habituated to fight in a way or another. Like, also there, mostly at a militia level, nothing special, but they were more habituated to violence. The problem, as warfare increased in scale, is that the promiscuity between the soldiers and the local populations, especially during increasingly large wars of devastations, as well, think about the 30 Years' War, but not only, really witnessed the increase in the risk of epidemics. Let's say the connection between the strategic goals and the fact that this could be messed up by all the hygienic issues of increasing promiscuity with the civilians, the possibility of illness spread, were to be taken care of more drastically, right? First of all, we'll see it in some videos I've prepared for a not far away future. There were, aside from the political, the moral stigmatization, naturally specific reasons in this sense to avoid sacks, violence on the civilian population. At large, this could be more or less wanted, and definitely the political, again, will was more important, also by the side of the same commanders. But it was soon seen that aside from the fact that the population will hate you and will surely create some resistance, some guerrilla, whatever, killing people, raping them, really not giving them anything to it, destroying their goods, etc., is going to immediately spread illnesses much faster, and the soldiers are simply into it, and so they're going to get sick anyway. So this is going to seriously threaten, compromise the effectiveness of the same army. We know really that even just some objects could be contaminated, right? There were some illnesses where, there are beautiful depictions of this in even works like, the idea of those who anointed all places, the Black Legions of always like the Jewish scapegoats that wanted to spread further the epidemic. So this kind of sort of pretty dark paintings of a world that, for example, if you read Manzoni, are quite widely illustrated, and sort of the loss of reason, the loss of control in front of this great, say, punishment that seems to have been given by a divine wrath. Especially when you look at also at the indiscriminate sexual relations, you understand how dangerous the thing could get. For example, the spread of gonorrhea and of flu was really incapacitating, as frequent and really something that could be transmitted that easily in every one of this average context. There were some hygienic criteria, and not only of decorum, that all the norms regarding personal and collective hygiene were inspired too. For example, the construction of the latrines, the burial of the dead animals. Those, as you know, were used as chemical weapons. For example, in the Middle Ages, trebuchet, dead cows or horses of people, for that matter, infected with a plague into the enemy set. But a little bit too much of a mythology around it, but it did happen. It was mostly due for psychological reasons. Like, would be that it's that impacting to be locked into a city, not having anything to eat, and even more like having the carcass of a cow, exploding into your, into such tiny spaces, and getting to get rid of it in the first place. You have, for example, also this measure that aimed at the destruction of garbage with fire, exactly to eliminate all sort of the bacterial spread. Of course, they didn't know how it really, what it really was about, but they understood how it worked, and so they already would take measures of this kind. And as every law that is so also sometimes harshly enforced reveals, of course, how serious the problem was, right? How how frequent the problem really was. There is, of course, aside from the practicality, an ideology that comes together with that, right? There is the will of the command to rationalize the life of the troops, and also like flattening a bit these troops. We've seen how the Protestant thought contributed to this sort of dehumanization, this alienation, for the sake of increasing the collective effectiveness of the units against the sort of acts of individualism, individual pride. And so just obliging the troops to obey, and again, committing them even to this sort of routine and dimension, and making them understand that everyone was dependent on one another as far as this was concerned, because if one screwed up, all the others could also pay the consequences for this, not disciplinarily, but if not discipline, just because of, for example, the spread of an illness. It was beneficial to regularize the obedience, right? And so all this contributed since the beginning of the modern age, and before that, of course, to compact the developing armies along a disciplinary line. However, also in this sense, we should point out that behind especially the 18th century norms, we see, aside from the hygienic disciplinary reason, also in that case, the Enlightenment ideology. For example, what the Piedmontese nobleman and officer Parini refers to as clean air, that at least in this time, it's not much like an Enlightenment, like it's part of the traditional side of the Enlightenment, the idea that especially cities were not a terrific place to live in, like the sanitary infrastructures were only at this point sort of starting to develop for also the increasing size of the cities themselves, and that, however, this called into question the behavior, a broader discipline, the behavior, for example, of the third, the fourth estate, and how this could be disciplined, it couldn't be arranged, also urbanistically and just through the broader sciences of settlement, and so how an absolutistic dirigism wanted to control the whole thing. So it's what we're saying at the beginning regarding a broader sense, even to sometimes towards not necessarily the abstraction, but the ideal, right, that takes on that sort of liminal tangent. Practically, much of these problems took a lot of time to be fixed, very empirically, by the way, and gradually. It's interesting also to observe the religious component of the disciplinary provisions, and it's almost jarring to see how those troops that should have been fighting for, and were in a sense inspired by the most rigorous and profound religious feelings, such as the Dutch ones of William the Silent or the English ones of Cromwell, were imposed find some norms, the respect towards the chaplains, or they had to be solicited to actually attend the religious gatherings, which you otherwise would have thought propagandistically or ideally to have been obvious, like uniform, impeccable in such armies. It would have been a more reasonable concern in forces like the ones of the Duke of Alba or of Wallenstein that were of mixed confession. That's also sort of an underestimated aspect, that even though the first part of this period especially is the age of the confessional wars, it was really normal in different armies regarding the sort of various policies regarding the religious uniformity within the troops to find, as a matter of fact, both Catholics and Protestants fighting like that. Think about the Imperial Army of Frundsberg, who sacked Rome, and there it turned out that, in fact, the Protestant Germans did not misbehave so atrociously against the population like the Catholic Spanish, which tells you what the entire world really worked like, and how really from both sides things were not really working as they should have. But don't underestimate either the deep conviction that very often these people really had, and how war actually puts you under a lot of stress and tests you as far as this fate is also concerned, and the reason why you're there all intertwines in the most, again, atrocious way possible, as warfare, as we well know, is essentially the environment in which the greatest things that are at stake that you can positively control, attentively through action. Right? There are bigger changes that are much more general and can't be, and say, mankind hasn't placed, at least at this point in history, like individual people to manage, especially at this point with, in fact, the explosion of Catholicism and the decline of universal authorities. So much happens that nobody even thinks that they can change. But war is that place, and so you always have to look at the motivation of these individuals. And naturally, and especially in the 18th century, there was a great lucidity as far as discipline went, as we observed also in the videos about the development of military treatises, about the art of war, and we have really explored the topic in the same von Kriege series in a historical sense. There you have a much more positively applicable set of notions of military theory proper that would turn out like to be significantly useful on campaign. It would never substitute nor come close to substitute the direct military experience, but the commands were starting to take into consideration, say, the practice of warfare was definitely like a big thing, and big and regulated thing by this point, enough to sort of point out what specific provisions that could be taken. Needless to say, in this context, Frederick the Great is definitely the most active individual. Like the Prussian king posed himself like this problem of discipline and its value with absolute lucidity, given the particular political and strategical needs of Prussia, that went down properly to the individual soldier, to tactics. I know, because this was still a small country, at least compared to the major neighbors, Russia, Austria, France, and as you know, it risked to disappear multiple occasions from the map. It was saved actually not by Prussian discipline in those cases of the miracles of the House of Brandenburg, but definitely there would have been many more of those occasions hadn't the Prussian army been so, as you know, qualitative and performing and being properly apt to that listed specific strategical context that the sovereign had molded it into. Right, and according to Frederick's own words, the way armies had to be regulated by discipline had to mirror the mechanism of a clock. Right, this clock metaphor actually had been used since Galileo. There was an idea of mechanism was attracting even these more purely sort of moral minds, as far as especially probably morale and discipline, and what in this case the Prussian soldiers had to do. Right, we made videos about probably the training, the psychology, the performance of Prussian infantry under Frederick the Great. Were let's say, the product of a time which, as we just said, military theory seemed to point at the fact that, given also the increasing standardization, not just of the individual, say, of national armies, but of these with the other ones around, the battlefield took on an ever more geometric image. Like, that's also where Jomini sort of started from, to think that ideally we could have the mathematical equations to know every time what is the right move to make. And from Clausewitz, that also stems from the same, a step further in the evolution of Prussian military culture says, bear in mind that there are moral forces and that warfare is just an instrument of politics, and so it reflects some forces that you cannot calculate, first of all, because how do you calculate moral forces if not by, just guts and feelings? And so some qualities that you cannot put on paper, really, and that are also fueled by experience, and that, in fact, cannot be properly mathematically sorted out, right? It's just a waste of time. We're calculating every angle, every corner, every distance. The enemy has already taken you out, right? But the sense, indeed, that, especially and also later times, soldiers had been successfully brought down to, to that level of obedience, had indeed allowed sort of more complex and, successful tactics, operations to be carried out with the security of at least a positive enactment. Then aside, like, war is always that tough encounter, that wrestling match. You do not know what the enemy is capable of doing until you actually show what you're capable of doing as well. So that the problem would not be solved. We've seen in the aforementioned videos about Prussian infantry how, for example, Frederick was this is slightly different. It's not really a mechanistic thing. It's mostly morally based, but he was convinced that the future of warfare would have been, maybe not the future of warfare, strictly speaking, that there was a chance of the bayonet, right, of close combat, of cold steel, to be resulted in battle. So it's something that the French would toy to explain explained it in the video about the Grande Querelle within the French Royal Army. The 18th century is the pinnacle of linear tactics, but since the column could maybe resolve the encounters in general and preferring it to the line, was still, again, toyed with as a concept, as an idea, and showing how the same place, some enormous military minds could be wrong. Like Frederick, for example, had to find out the hard way that actually firepower was, especially like in the second half of the 18th century, like gaining the upper hand. Like artillery combined with musketry fire was just, the thing that would have stamped also the most determined Pomeranian, grenadier charge, like for that matter. And we will get more into those kind of things. Many of you have always asked me to talk more about linear tactics because we all like it so much. Yes, I agree. It's very fascinating. It's also like had I been a modernist, I would have probably not specialized. I would specialize in the 18th century, after the 17th, after the 16th. But it's also extremely fascinating, and I want Schwerpunkt to be about this. We will keep looking at, say, even some battle or even corner of battle that can be more or less didactic regarding these kind of cognitions, acquisitions, and what could be properly acquired, also how they could be interpreted by those who were in charge of the military in the first place. If you think about the Prussian dressur, for example, you realize how almost metallic and mechanic, just like Frederick's clock, the sense could be. There is much more actually behind, a mere material mechanism. I made some video explaining how as late as the 18th century, uniforms were incredibly loaded with not just traditional, properly warrior symbols. Like, of course, the warrior had been long crushed under the heels of this fantassin, but because of collective superiority, collective training, and the inferiority of warriorism, at least. There's always a warrior within every fantasy still, otherwise you wouldn't have a soldier really, but the soldier in fact is something more functional, at least to a more developed and effective system. And in fact, when you really look at, especially the Ancien regime, and still in the 18th century, you do not really look much, even among Protestant armies that had emphasized the most this sense of alienation, of essentially a worthlessness of the individual work, but the rigid, the blind subordination to the ultimate principle, the properly dehumanizing side of the story, right? These uniforms, again, there was a great deal of not just of esprit de corps as far as the regiment, as far as the single unit was concerned, but something extra, something that really did reward even that individual side of the story sometimes. In fact, 18th century warfare was not so tidy, geometric, and perfectly aligned as we tend to imagine it. If anything, really the psychological attitude towards this uniformity was in the same times of automatons and carillons, rather appearing as the refined product of the human ingenuity and will, right? It was the positive sort of thinking of the Age of Enlightenment, right? We call the enlightened rulers, in fact, individuals like Maria Theresia, Joseph II, Frederick II, Catherine II, but they weren't at all that sort of progressive monarchs, if not in a strictly, say, empirically functional sense. They were also not absolutistic at all, because the only absolutistic system was really the one that was imposed with the nation state that really disciplines everything without any possibility of even a negotiation within the institutional mechanism, as the source, the law, say the state becomes the sole source of law, really. And if you had asked, of course, of Frederick II, there are some interesting anecdotes because he was very funny. He had a great humor, like about any of this sort of liberal ideas, sort of the worst side of the Enlightenment. He would simply say that, those who talk too much about this tended to end up hanged, right? And transferring to the military life, this sort of political ideal of his time, especially of his character, Frederick was not willing to grant the common soldier, for the same good of the troop, any other prerogative, if not that of a scrupulous and ready obedience. There was no other way to make things work well but by enforcing that blind obedience that could happen many ways. Like, it could come through the traditional fides, but the idea is that the world had been degenerating fast enough so that these more brutal means had become necessary. But if you look back at history, like, say, such discipline practically in relative terms had always been needed to make things work. Surely, like, not digress of, say, the composition of Frederick the Great's armies that were, of course, put together in, say, less ideal ways, that the sense of the nation emerging as, even still, as essentially united by this bond with a single ruler, as sort of in a private way was conceived, at least was generally conceived, especially in such an archaic country like Prussia. The soldier, in fact, in this sense, was not meant to think at all, right? And from the moment that the notions of honor and valor, so this came from culture, but also from the estate, had nothing to do with him. Only the terror of discipline would have kept him in case of danger and or of euphoria sometimes, of hubris as well, at his own place. Right. So when in open fields, the lines were under pressure and were risking to collapse, the King of Prussia knew well that his officers would have had gotten themselves killed on the spot in order to save their honor. The 7 Years' War was a veritable bath of Prussian officers. They were that channeled within this function. It's estimated that 70% of the Junker were essentially killed due to this duty. Like in the first line, this also helped the same Prussia to compact further politically, because naturally the few, say, survivors were getting more and were easier to, of course, to be co-opted in a sense. But it had been really a struggle for survival. It was objectively not a formula, but the one that Frederick had, by the way, managed so brilliantly to impose. For example, for the officers, for the cavalrymen that were generally of higher status, the risk of seeing themselves stripped of their own banners, decorations, and epaulettes was greater than the one of losing their own life. Like, they would have been disgraced socially, they would have been deemed to be cowards, they would have not been able to progress further unless they had sort of ransomed their own honor back in battle. But some of them would literally kill themselves had that actually happened. So it was better actually to get themselves killed in action, because at least risking it, because if they had, first of all, it would have been better for their memory, for their family, also had they fallen. But had they won, they would have definitely collected all the deserved recognition. But when we talk about the troop, really, this did not ignore the fact that their superiors deployed, at least sometimes, behind them. It's not that they weren't risking for that reason, would have not hesitated a single instant to kill them had they not obeyed orders. And this was absolutely normal. Prince Eugene would simply shoot people fleeing without any necessity of court-martialing them. It was just a world in which the sense of honor was so high and people were so respected, say, for their own essence, their valor, that a figure of this state, or in charge of the situation, somebody fleeing from combat was enough. Just have the guy killed, just like that. And this worked, right? It was not just about the harshness of the discipline, but also the constancy of the example, of making this case of the Prussian army that model that in fact would soon impose itself by imitation all over Europe. Right? Before this, it's not like the discipline was light, whatever, but it was more ad hoc as far as the administration of punishment, for example, was concerned. It wasn't much of scientific regulation being valid or all the time. Nor it would actually be later. Everything would be, in the sense, more regulated, but to be judged. And so things were much more empirical, of course, than we tend to see. But what the Prussian discipline had demonstrated, as far as the consequences, like the fruits of such harshness, was really that important and effective, that all armies, as we've seen, were all alike basically at this time in the West, adopted it as a sort of standard. And so from the king to the last NCO, nobody demanded from the troop that it was what really he would have not been able to do, would have not been disposed to do himself, right? This is what we were saying before regarding the fact that these commanders were, however, themselves into the fray. The same Frederick II would lead attacks. Prince Eugene himself, the same officers, NCOs, were again there, and they got themselves killed. So all this disciplinary system was based on a uniformity. It was not just horizontal but vertical. All the ranks in this hierarchy had to behave in the same, not quite in the same way actually, like those who were in the higher ranks, as always, had the greater responsibility, the greater pressure, right? Much more than the individual soldier, even when this was killed, really. Think about Frederick the Great's mental breakdowns after major defeats, and how these people were sort of trained mentally to withstand these massive blows that nobody else but in their position would have recognized the impact of it, what people today do not understand as far as what individual responsibility really means for for the chiefs, for the leaders. And at the same time, this incredibly harsh discipline that determined this also large, desperate and continuous attempts of desertion, many of which were exemplarily punished, others instead succeeding, found a limit in its same tension, right? Especially after the 7 Years' War that had been a massive bloodbath in this sense, and in spite of the winners and the losers, there had been a massive sort of attention towards these disciplinary issues for how much they had a sense of work, but also how much they had cost. Same rigorous proponent of Prussian discipline himself actually, as the Zaldan, could state that an officer could have obtained more from the soldiers with understanding than with terror. And this naturally was true. Like, there is a sense of omni-powerfulness in the sense of having managed to reach this level of obedience historically, this level of control and affirmation of power. But at the same time, this was observed had not to exceed. Like, discipline is not just what happens in combat. All right, it's what you have to go through during the entire military life, and much of this has to do actually with the same, let's say, what the same comrades will do to give you a tough time into it. So that was something, but of course there was also a greater terror coming from the above, because of the greater forces that, as we've seen, were moving at those heights, and that could really as blindly like punish, for example, an entire unit for some issues that could have also been more say individually addressed depending on circumstance. I mean, to an extent you can't do that. Like, there is always a sense of honor and standard you have to maintain. It's exactly what discipline is, right? For one, everybody pays. This may be unjust, but it's still a way to actually enforce this discipline homogeneously in a way that really works. It really makes everybody more than attentive to such issues. But at the same time, especially commanders, Zaldan was really talking from that perspective, understood that, yeah, there hadn't to be excesses. Basically, every situation remain balanced, as it had always to be balanced, as it had always been intended to be. Again, the uniformity of discipline is something that's basically affirming itself just at this point, and you can argue that until the nation state, it wasn't really that truly uniform, and that even after that, it was more uniform, but never flawless. But there were other ideas that, in a sense, were also a bit more humanistic, and not necessarily better. For example, when you look at, say, at least there is a motivation that enters as sort of a greater cause, like the necessity of politics to give the soldier a reason to fight for, which in this sense it depends, because it varies. For example, the U.S. War of Independence, or the one of the French Revolution, are different in the content, probably, of the inspiration of the political models and so on. It is true that there is sort of, at least nominally, greater emphasis placed on the individual, especially in different ways, at least. But it doesn't mean that the systems that sprang from this, were actually giving that greater, say, meaningfulness, at least to the individual. Actually, in war, like mass warfare would bring to a greater expendability of sources, including the soldiers, even more. And I just made a video about World War I that highlights this issue for that matter. So there would be, let's say, different ways to, however, involve the soldier through, again, higher beliefs, like ideologically, emotionally. This had also always been there, but now it tends to be uniform, at least to be sold on a larger scale than before, with unprecedented means and with unprecedented political and social conditions, emphasizing the cause for which the soldiers were fighting. That was now bringing the issue of discipline on a yet another unprecedented level. So politically, in the name of the cause, you could have asked at this point sacrifices to the troops that would have been really unthinkable up to that point, but the imposition of which would have seemed, however, to every commander rather illegitimate when exceeding, in fact, the ordinary duty. So there is an ideologization, like almost an extremization of beliefs that becomes almost fundamentalistic. In the age of the nation state, the ministries of education were adamant about the fact that, in fact, forestaters now provided partially what would say an equal, a pool of rights that had been unprecedented as far as voting ones and so on, were to be specifically indoctrinated into very minimal information that had nothing in terms of personal development or whatever. And that was aimed to essentially hate this country or another, just going to war because of it. And so standard packing the reasons for which, of course, understandably, a country would actually go to war for another, but in order to channel the mass, like the fury of the people, remember the third element of the Clausewitzian Trinity, in the most effective way, but again in a subservient one. So yes, in all these states are growing, people are living better than they did in the past, but at the same time their individual relevance was decreasing in the bigger picture. And so here we are still today, except you can argue that both systems have gone both opposites are sort of exasperated to a degree that there is kind of the worst of them, and not the fully functional civic order and, in fact, discipline that you need in order to understand, for example, why wars are fought, not buying cheap propaganda for, the mentally feeble that apparently the average person today is exclusively out-indoctrinating themselves into. It's always consciously, by the way, to a degree. And at the same time, let's say, believing, being capable of being disciplined. Really refusing any kind of effort, any kind of individual accomplishment, any kind of value, as was instead understood by these people at the time, still in the 18th century, for example, in the Ancien regime. Yes, these soldiers do not have to think, but the world is still framed within the idea that, after all, exactly because everyone is different, there is a role that each one has to fulfill, and they have to do it well, and that's the role of the lesser element, that is, however, still understood with the minimal part of actual liberty that that they would enjoy, that they still had in the military. This is what I want to say, because out there in civilian life, except for the fact that it could be brought to war, that they would have some sort of life that was gradually also increasing in, as we were saying, in quality. But everything was commensurated, in fact, to that degree, to that level. Today, people essentially think that they are normal, and they're indoctrinated into thinking that they are normal, even though there is practically nothing normal about them or being a human being in the first place. And they are automatically trained not to ask, because they're easier to control, or at least they want to be controlled. And so they're actually the ones that always choose, right? They are never the real issue. They, as subjects, they are the issue in the moment in which they simply decide themselves that that's the place that they actively want to be, and there's no there is a shared responsibility with the government, but the government can never exist in any time and place in the history of mankind without the support of the people. And the reason, of course, like there is just a minimal part of the population is also the better one that makes governments go on in a more or less functional way, in spite of the people that are actually the reason why, in fact, a sewer people has sewer government, and that's the obvious reason. There is no such thing like, I have a sewer government, but I belong to such a pure, proud, beautiful, intelligent, developed culture of people. No, you're a sewer people, and the worst part of this is that you perfectly know you are. You're just acting feministically to pretend others not to see that. This is typical inferior cultures of feeling ashamed about themselves and trying to fake it because they have nothing to lose. They're already sewer people, and so they actually get what they deserve always. Tradition in this is crystal clear, is beautiful, is noble, is intelligent. Such hierarchy is what it is for these very listed reasons. And so there is definitely all a way you can appreciate this further once you study history of discipline, because it can really dissolve a lot of misconceptions and problems. And when you realize how fast the world accelerated in the last 100 years, you can study it really through the same the very same history of discipline. For example, it's not much of a mystery, and it's you can appreciate it every step of the way just through this indicator, right? And adding it to all the rest that you have and need, right? Naturally, we'll keep talking about discipline because it's a very interesting topic, how it happened, how it see, this level of brutality is very often skipped. Like, people normally think that, oh my god, everybody was a hero here. I would have been loved by this guy who was the king of this nation. No, he would have thought that you're just a lesser element, and would have not actually, and especially you today, would have been an abomination of a subnormal development of humanity, and they would have been ashamed actually that their country eventually generated someone like you, that turned to be the country that it is. So the cheap superficiality with which people tend to project their own sort of mental delirium on the past just to flatter themselves is probably the single most the cringiest aspect of our current culture. We must eradicate it. It's really impossible to go on in this situation unless you really want just weak people everywhere, and so useless people everywhere. There is again a lot to add, and a lot to scope at every time in this circumstance, but we will see it another time. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.